Dale, dale. Listo.
Voy a parar el recording y lo ingreso. A ver. Atendí. Ay, espérate. Es que no me deja aceptar a los atendís. No sé qué le pasa a esto.
Ya entró Tony. Tony
Ya
Appleton.
entró.
Can you hear me?
Yes, Tony, we
Yes, how
can
are
hear
you?
you.
Good. Good. Can you see me?
Buenos días a todos. Muchas gracias por unirse a nuestro webinar, el webinar número 8 organizado por la Red Colombiana de Investigadores de Energía Eólica Marina. Mi nombre es Margarita Nieves, yo soy directora de esta red. Estoy muy contenta de que nos acompañen hoy para abordar un tema tan interesante como cómo construir, cómo crear una industria de energía eólica marina, donde veremos la experiencia del Reino Unido y también revisaremos la preparación portuaria que requiere Colombia para que esta industria sea una realidad. Este webinar lo organizamos con el apoyo de la Asociación Colombiana de Ingenieros, Capítulo Atlántico, y también con el apoyo de Kinewell. Estamos muy contentos de tener hoy a Tonny Appleton y a Ernesto Forero, quienes compartirán su conocimiento y experiencia en este tema con toda nuestra audiencia. Me gustaría que probemos si pueden usar el chat. Ya veo que lo pueden usar, eso me alegra mucho. Y un poco sobre la estructura o la dinámica que tendremos hoy. Primero, pues vamos a tener la presentación de Tony, luego tendremos la presentación de Ernesto, al final abriremos un espacio para preguntas y al final del webinar también queremos compartirles un poco sobre nuestras próximas actividades, principalmente la primera conferencia de energía eólica marina de Colombia que realizaremos en noviembre. Bienvenidos a todos. Quiero darle la palabra a Georgianis, que nos acompaña por parte de la Asociación Colombiana de Ingenieros, Capítulo Atlántico.
Hola, muy buenos días a todos. Un gusto en tenerlos a todos aquí presentes. Mi nombre es Georgianis Pelufo, líder de comunicaciones de la Asociación Colombiana de Ingenieros, así en Capítulo Atlántico. Bueno, les quiero contar un poquito de qué es la asociación. Nosotros somos una organización gremial que trabaja por el fortalecimiento del ejercicio profesional de la ingeniería, la innovación y la integración de nuestro sector con el ámbito productivo y académico. Desde nuestro capítulo regional también impulsamos actividades de formación, congresos, foros y espacios de relacionamiento, siempre con el propósito de contribuir al desarrollo sostenible y el crecimiento de la ingeniería aquí en el Caribe colombiano. Además, también nosotros somos como un puente de articulación con universidades, empresas, entidades gubernamentales y gremios, tanto a nivel nacional como internacional. También generamos alianzas estratégicas que potencian la investigación, la innovación y el liderazgo de nuestros ingenieros. Por eso hoy quiero invitarlos a todos los que se encuentran aquí presentes en este maravilloso webinar a que nos sigan en nuestras redes sociales para que hagan parte de nuestra asociación y conozcan un poco más. Aparecemos como @asienatlántico en todas nuestras redes sociales. Entonces, muchas gracias. Y ahora para continuar con nuestra agenda, le cedo la palabra a Jennifer García, quien nos acompañará con la traducción de la primera parte del webinar. Adelante, Jennifer.
Hola, muy buenos días. Muchas gracias, Georgianis. Bueno, quiero comentarles cómo se activa la interpretación para esta sesión. En la parte inferior de sus pantallas pueden encontrar varios iconos, entre ellos participantes, chat, reaccionar, y en unos momentos va a aparecer el icono de interpretación para que puedan escoger su idioma de preferencia. En este caso, si hablan español y quieren escuchar la traducción en español, pueden escoger el idioma español. Entonces, en unos momentos, Margarita asignará a los intérpretes y aparecerá este pequeño icono del globo terráqueo con las opciones. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Jenny. Entonces, por favor, en interpretación, escogen para el salón donde pues pueden escuchar en español o inglés, dependiendo del idioma que prefieran. Voy a asignar a Jennifer. Y a Eric. Ya están asignados. Y bueno, vamos a corroborar. Nos escriben en el chat, por favor, si pudieron conectarse. Saludos a Arturo, a Jairo Vergara, que están conectados. Por favor, nos confirman si pueden conectarse, si ya pudieron hacer ese ajuste de idioma. Y vamos a ver acá a Jenny para corroborar si todo está bien. Jenny, ¿me confirmas si ya todo está bien, porfa, acá en el chat? Y bueno, entonces iniciemos. Vamos a iniciar. Este es nuestro primero webinar bilingüe. Estamos muy contentos por ello. Y vamos a iniciar con Tonny. Tonny es ingeniero mecánico de la Universidad de Newcastle. Tiene una amplia trayectoria de más de 32 años en el sector energético. Actualmente es director comercial de Kinewell y ha trabajado en más de 50 proyectos de energía eólica marina en el Reino Unido y en Estados Unidos. Dentro de sus posiciones también se destaca que fue miembro de la Junta Directiva de Oceantic, que es la Asociación de Energía Marina Renovable en Estados Unidos, y también de Offshore Wind en California. Su experiencia va a ser muy relevante para países nuevos, emergentes como Colombia, que quieren estar en esta industria. Te damos la palabra, Tonny.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Margarita, for the kind introduction. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on which part of the world you're in. As Margarita says, my name is Tonny Appleton. I'm the Chief Commercial Officer at a company called Kinewell Energy in the UK, in Newcastle upon Tyne. I'm a chartered mechanical engineer and a fellow of the Institute of Mechanical Engineers. I've been in the power sector for about 35 years, with about 18 years in offshore wind. I've been involved in something like 50 offshore wind projects worldwide, and I've undertaken everything from feasibility, viability, bankability, the very early stages of an offshore wind project, all the way through operation and maintenance. The only aspect of offshore wind I've not done yet to date is decommissioning, because basically there hasn't been much decommissioning done anywhere in the world. I've also been lucky enough to work with all the stakeholders involved in an offshore wind project, from the local communities to the developers to the OEMs, the supply chain, all the way up to governments, advising, supporting, educating, and helping to develop the industry globally. Thanks, Chris. So the focus of the discussion today is not really about me giving all the answers, because Colombia has got to develop the answers itself. What I will try and do today is get people to think about what the questions they should be asking. So, you know, I'll try and give the benefit of my experience. I'll try and look at things I've learned over the last 20 years. So I'll try and discuss those with you. These are my point of view, so people will have different point of views, but this is coming from my experience and what I've learned. I am basing this on assuming that I know very little about the Colombian context. I am looking at this as a sort of standalone opportunity to express my views and to give you the benefit of my experience. And hopefully most of what I'll be saying will be applicable to what's happening in Colombia, and hopefully you know everybody be able to learn something from this. So what I've done is I've broken it down. Well, I've broken the presentation down into sort of 4 or 5 key areas. The first one I will very quickly just talk about Kinewell Energy, the company I work for, but The 4 key areas I will be talking about are policy, that's government and state, approach, what the approach should be, stakeholder engagement, and technology, because they are, as I see it, the 4 key areas of offshore wind. But before I do that, if I may, I'll do a quick introduction about Kinewell Energy, about who we are and what we do. We are an optimization team. We create software solutions, and we use advanced mathematics to help develop the offshore wind market. We do this by a cost optimization. We do this, we hope to accelerate projects and mitigate skill shortages. And we also like to think we can de-risk projects. I've been with the company, what I should say is I've been with the company for about 3 months, and what they do is they develop software that I wish I'd known about 20 years ago, because it would have helped the development of offshore wind would have happened much more quickly and much more smoothly and more cheaply as well. But that's enough sort of marketing from my personal perception. Chris, next slide, please. So the team, we're a fairly small team. As I say, we're based in the northeast of England. I think it's about 1/3 of our team have got PhDs, but we are electrical engineers, we are mechanical engineers, data scientists, optimization specialists, and software developers. And as I said before, our mission is to help develop and commercialize technologies that will add significant scalable value and impact the offshore wind projects, saving money, and doing things more quickly. That's what we're trying to do, and that's helping to grow the offshore wind globally. We've been very successful in some of the awards we've got, and most recently we were awarded the King's Award for international trade, which is a great honor to have if you're a British company. Thanks, Chris. So basically, we have 5 primary software solutions. On our headline software solution is the cable lay optimization. So basically, what that does, that looks at the cable between the turbines and works out what the best solution is to get all the turbines connected up to the substation in the cheapest and most cost-effective way. And when we've done this on projects we've been working on so far, we've saved an average of about 20% of the cable system capex, or approximately $28 million per project that we've looked at, which is not huge in the overall scale of an offshore wind project, but it's when projects are looking to save a few percent here and a few percent there, this is a good start to that. The second software we've developed is the wake optimizations. That's looking at turbine layouts, looking at the best place to get the best placing of the turbines to get the maximum yield out of the wind, the available wind. The third piece of software is the transmission. So basically, you've got a generating area and you've got a load center. So how do you get the power between the two? It's kind of as simple as that. And then the fourth software is actually bringing those first 3 together, because in some ways what you're trying to do with the array cable layout may not be the optimal layout for the wind turbines, and what you're trying to do with the layout for the wind turbines may not be the optimal solution for the transmission system. So they can conflict with each other. So we've also developed a software that actually brings the 3 of them together and comes up with the best optimal solution for the wind farm as a whole. More recently, we've acquired another piece of software called Forecoast. And this looks at helps wind farm owners look at the operation and maintenance of a wind farm. Next slide, please, Chris. So why us? I won't go into a lot of detail about this, but basically we use supercomputing, which basically means it happens very, very quickly. A lot of people do the services that we provide. Ours happens in a very, very, very quick very, very quick time, and it's done by experienced engineers, and it's been proved to the market already. So I'm very excited about it. As I say, I've been involved in offshore wind, and I wish I'd known about this earlier. Next slide, please, Chris. So onto the bulk of the presentation now. So, Chris, you've gone too far. Can you go back? Thank you. So basically, there are three areas that I'm going to talk about in terms of policy. So the first one is the government, the state policy, including the sort of 20, 30, 50-year goals. I say that because what the industry likes to see, what we've seen in the industry globally elsewhere, is stop-start. It's going to happen. It happens for 3 years and it stops. Policy changes, government changes, and what we're starting to see in the more developed countries. And when I say developed countries, I don't mean I mean countries that have developed offshore wind more than others. So, like the UK, we are looking at 10, 20, 30, 50-year goals now. And what that does, that gives security of supply to the supply chain. They're interested in, they're not going to build a factory, for example, in a location if it's only one project they're looking at, 2 projects they're looking at, 3 projects. They want to see a continuous pipeline coming through, and that's when you get the major investment. So that's something that perhaps the Colombian government can be thinking about. Is what are the goals? Let's put some plans in place for the next up to 50 years away. The technology may not be known, but it might be a case of, well, by 2075, we want so many gigawatts of offshore wind, and this is how we want it phased. We want to put so many gigawatts in the water so much every 10 years, and it's important to do that, as I say, to help the supply chain look at what the demand is and how they can help support that. It needs to be non-political. That's a key issue. So what we're talking about here is energy supply. If energy supply is political, it's going to stop-start. We're seeing that. We have seen that in Europe. We are seeing that in other countries around the world at the moment, and it does make things very, very difficult for the industry. So it needs to be, sort of cross-party, cross-government, cross sector, and it needs to be depoliticalized as far as possible. What offshore wind can help do is provide stability of energy resource. It can provide self-reliance. You don't need to import power either directly as electrons or as oil and gas. It makes it's a security supply going forward for up to 50 years kind of thing. I guess that's up to 50 years, depending on what the goal is. But also it can be used as there is technology out there that can help security and defense. This is one of the things that needs to be thought about, as well as it's actually how offshore wind is developed can help security and defense issues, and I'll come on to that a little bit later. It's one of the reasons for having this sort of state procurement policy is to give security to the developers, as I say, not only to the supply chain but to the developers. If a country stop-starts, and unfortunately I will use the example of the USA, if a country stop-starts, the developers who are global will say, okay, we're not interested in that country. There are too many other projects going on elsewhere in the world. We'll go and focus on that. So so the problems that offshore wind in the USA has now got is there is less interest by the developers to continue there because they're not quite sure what's going to happen and where it's going to go. So that does make life very, very, very difficult. Just moving on to the next point, permitting. Permitting is a huge issue across the world, and what I mean by permitting is allowing projects to be built. What particularly environmental permits are required. The US, again, I'll pick on the USA. Unfortunately, I apologize, USA. On average in the USA, it takes 160 permits average, that sort of order, to get a wind farm permitted. This is pre current political environment. In Europe, in the UK, it takes about 6 permits. Things are a lot easier in Europe. So again, what the government needs to do is thinking about the permitting policy. Have it defined early. Don't make any changes. Don't change from area to area. Have a consistent approach. Very, very, very key. Transmission. Key here is think about what you want. Take a holistic approach. Stand back. Look at the bigger picture. Where you're trying to go. What are you trying to do? Don't think about transmission on a case-by-case basis. Stand back. Think about where you want the transmission system to be, what it to look like in 20, 30, 40 years time. Whether it's AC, whether it's DC, whether there's an offshore grid that needs to be developed, whether there's an onshore grid that needs to be developed. What expansion needs to be is required. What other connections are there going to be? Is Colombia going to connect to Ecuador, Venezuela, Peru, Brazil? Have interconnectors taking place there. You can buy and sell power that way. Perhaps that's a good. So it's a good approach, but that involves again talking to your local partners, as it were, the local countries around you. What transmission upgrades are going to be required? Where are the load centers? Where's the power needed? Where's the power going to be generated, and where's the power needed? How are you going to get the power between the two? In the UK, when we first started offshore wind, it was all point to point. It was all wind farm directly to the grid, wind farm to the grid, wind farm to the grid, wind farm to the grid. There's only so many places you can connect into the grid. So perhaps what you want to think about is some kind of meshed network. Very, very difficult to organize. We tried in Europe for a long time to do that. I was talking about a mesh grid in the North Sea 20 years ago. It still hasn't really happened. The US, New York, New Jersey, we're talking about a mesh grid. It's complicated. It's actually the best solution overall, but it's very, very difficult to get there. But perhaps if Colombia thinks about what they want to do now, they perhaps can think about that and think about how they could incorporate a mesh grid, either onshore or offshore, or a combination of the two. It's an interesting approach, but you need to look at again, reiterating, you need to look at the bigger picture about where the load centers are and where the generators are. In the UK, it's taken us 20 years, but we've finally worked out that what we need to do is to get some HVDC bootstraps that go from the generating centres in Scotland and north of Scotland in the North Sea down to where the load centres are in England. But it's taken 20 years to get there. It's happening now, but it's taken a while to get there. Chris. So the approach, it's very much about, as I've said, integrating what's going on out there. What other generation is taking place in Colombia? What generation is taking place now? What generation will be taking place in 10, 20 years time? What I mean by that is there might be old coal plants, gas plants, nuclear plants that might be closing down. Where are they situated? How can you connect into those? What needs to be upgraded? And it's back to that policy discussion. Thinking about what's happening now versus where you want to be. In terms of the power demand, are there going to be data centers? Are there going to be far more EVs on the road in Colombia? How are you going to get the power to these load centers? This has to be thought about now. You can do it piece by piece. But what that means is there's going to be a lot of confusion, a lot of discussion, and a lot more cost. There's an opportunity at the minute to take to look at the bigger picture, and that's engaging, the governments, the transmission system operators, the big users. So there might be steel plants that use a lot of power. There might be data centers that are going to be built that use a lot of power. Engaging with these people now at this very, very early stage to work out how you're going to get the power, what power demand they want, and how you're going to get the power to them is absolutely key. If you do it later, it's going to cost a lot more money, and it's going to be far, far, far more complicated. And as I say, regional approach. Speak to the sister countries around Colombia. thinking about what their aspirations are, what your aspirations are, and how can you work together. Those conversations may be taking place already. I don't know. That back to my point about assuming I know nothing about the Colombia electrical system at the moment. But there is, it also depends. That's only possible country to country if the pricing mechanisms are the same. Sometimes you've got to look at the pricing mechanisms and thinking about how they work, and can cooperation happen? It may already be happening, which is great. So you're wanting to expand on that and make that perhaps a bigger issue for the region, because I'm sure that there are parts of the North and South America that haven't got the full grid integration that's required yet. So you've got to be thinking about that. So you not only are you expanding the grid in where the current load centers are, but are there going to be further load centers coming online later on? So you've got to think about that expansion of the grid. And again, that's country to country, because it might be easier to get as a silly example, to get the power from to the southern part of one country by going through the southern part of another country. It might be easier and cheaper to do that. So that's the sort of integration that needs to be thought about, and that needs to it needs to be thought about now. There's think about I'll come on to supply chain a little bit later, but think about the supply chain. Think about what's required. How Colombia wants to play the supply chain game. The UK thought about supply chain, but too late. So although the UK, excluding China, is the biggest developer of offshore wind in the world, we've got more installed capacity than anybody else apart from the Chinese. I think it's about 15 gigawatts at the moment, there or thereabouts. We have very, very little local supply chain apart from now O&M. So a lot of the big components, a lot of the big vessels, the big components are coming from elsewhere in the world or other countries, other companies, non-British companies, and it's something that Colombia needs to think about in terms of how are they going to develop that supply chain. It's very, very easy to say we want local content. But if that local content has never built a wind farm, it's going to take them longer and it's going to be more expensive. So therefore, perhaps you do need some international support to come in and help out. But it's how you do that, how you allow that international supply chain to engage. It's not the easiest thing in the world, but there's a balance to be struck. As I say, the UK have got it wrong 20 years ago. We said, anybody can get involved in what we do. But I think then America has gone perhaps too far the other way. What they were trying to do, they wanted massive amounts of local content, which in the US meant on a state-by-state basis. But the supply chain didn't exist in each of those states. So there's a contradiction taking place between local content and international supply chain, because the local content is ideal, but it's generally more expensive to start with until you start to get an understanding of what's required. One of the ways to do that is perhaps think about the scale at which you build the wind farms. If you start with smaller wind farms, the supply chain have got a chance. The local supply chain have got a chance to understand how to get involved in the sector, how to build these wind farms, how to use the technology. Then they can, if they learn it on a smaller project, say 100 megawatt project or a 200 megawatt project, you could learn to take those baby steps and then jump to the bigger gigawatt projects. That may be a way of doing it, but different countries want it. It's a race. I realize it's a race, but it's really to kind of what are you trying to do? Where are you trying to get to, and how quickly are you trying to get there? The other thing to think about very quickly is with the global supply chain is think about local restrictions. Again, I'm sorry, USA, I'm going to pick on you, but there's the Jones Act in the US means that only US built, owned, and operated vessels can build offshore wind farms and can sail from port to port in the US. And in the US, an offshore wind farm is viewed as a port. So if you want to take something from a port on shore to the wind farm, that can only be done with a US vessel. So if you want to take the components, if you want to use an installation vessel, load on shore and then use that installation vessel to build at the wind farm, that installation vessel has to be US manufactured, owned and operated. So that means, there are many Jones Act compliant vessels are operating in the US waters at the minute. And what that generally means then is there's a lot more double handling taking place. So what you would do is you would load on from the shore onto a barge. The barge goes out to the wind farm. The vessels pick up the components from the barge and then install. So it's double handling, and there's all sorts of risks involved in that. So again, think about what local restrictions are in place. We all understand why the Jones Act is in place, but perhaps there can be some mitigation, not just workarounds, but actually some mitigation of some of these local requirements. So it is, again, there's things to think about, things to be thought about there. Chris? Stakeholder engagement is absolutely key to developing a wind farm. In simple terms, what stakeholder engagement means is engage, and educate. Get people to understand what actually a wind farm does, what it can do, what it can provide, what it can support. And the sector in country needs to continually engage with the public, to gauge public opinion, to understand what the public is listening to and what the public is not listening to. Push back immediately on any misinformation that's out there. Key message, you've got to push back as quickly as possible, because at best the misinformation is from those that are poorly educated in offshore wind, in what offshore wind can do, and at worst it's a deliberate undermining of what's going on. Deliberately sending information out that is contradicting what the sector is saying to the world. You've got to push back on that as quickly as possible, because if you don't, it will gain momentum. Again, I will pick on an example. As far as the whales in New Jersey, a big play was made about that one. But there's the reality. Yes, there was some whales were washed up on beaches, as they are every year. The reality is about 70% of those whales were due to vessel strikes in the surrounding area. But approximately 1% of all the vessels that are in New Jersey operating in that area, 1% were offshore wind related. So that 70% of the whales that did perish, they've got to be pretty unlucky to have hit an offshore wind vessel, is the reality. But also the other thing about which again is not publicized, because misinformation, was if you had an offshore wind vessel sailing in New Jersey waters, it could go a maximum of 10 knots, and it would have lookouts on it looking for whales and watching what was going on. And if they saw something, the vessel had to stop immediately. In the meantime, a container ship could go past them doing 30 knots without any lookouts. So you have the double standards in there, and yet offshore wind was being blamed for all the whale deaths. That's sort of misinformation that people get hold of. That's the sort of misinformation that needs to be fought back straight away. Messaging is absolutely key. Listen to local communities, address their concerns. Talk to the fishing communities along the coastline. Talk to the local communities. There may be some archaeological sites, some ancient history, some areas of importance. They've all got to be discussed. The owners of those, the carers of those areas, need to be engaged with. You've got to think about areas of natural beauty, local environmental issues, national parks, sea animal movements. It's all got to be discussed. It's all got to be reviewed. It's all got to be discussed. Work out how everybody can work together. Because at the end of the day, offshore wind is just one of the industries in the blue economy. There are multiple industries out there. It's not just one or the others. Everybody's got to be working together. The new kids on the block are offshore wind, but oil and gas works together with telecoms. Oil and gas works together with fishing. There's no reason why offshore wind you can't do exactly the same thing. Just on the oil and gas point as well. again, a lot of people kind of get into their heads, well, it's got to be offshore wind or oil and gas. No, not at all. It's a mix. Offshore wind is part of the energy mix. It's not the answer on its own. It is part of the mix. So, so it's very, very important for people to understand that it's not trying to replace oil and gas. It's trying to be part of the mix of oil and gas. Fishing. There's been a lot of pushback from fishing communities around the world about what offshore wind can do and what it's not going to do. But just a couple of examples about that. The North Sea. We've had offshore wind in the North Sea for about 20 years. For those that know anything about the North Sea, the area of sea between sort of Scotland, England, France, Belgium, Holland, Germany, Denmark, that kind of area there. There's a lot of installed capacity there. The fish stocks in that North Sea have gone up over recent years, but the fishing quotas by each of those countries has not gone up. So we're not catching any more fish or any less fish than we were, say, 20 years ago. But the fish stocks have risen. So why have the fish stocks risen? Well, the reason why the fish stocks have risen is because around the base of each turbine, you're getting a micro reef. And what small sea-loving fish enjoy is a micro reef. So you get the small fish there, you get the bigger fish there, and suddenly there's a fishing community, a fish community there. So you've got all of these places now, all these additional places, and we're talking hundreds to thousands of them now in the North Sea, where where fish are breeding around these. Hence the fish stocks are going up. So guess what? The fishermen love it. Even in in the US, which is at the minute is offshore wind is not flavor of the month. You look at Block Island, those 5 turbines off the coast of Block Island. The sports fishermen up there think it's marvelous because the fish that are around the base of those turbines now is phenomenal. So fishing can take place within a wind farm. It's got to be done carefully. It's got to be done in a controlled way, but it can be done. So again, it's engaging with the fishing community, get them to understand what the impacts are. But obviously, engaging with the leisure community, the coastal communities that may have superb sea views, thinking about how far out the wind farms are going to be, but also as well, key is engaging with the military. Understanding what the military want, what they want to see, what they don't want to see. That's obviously important as well. But it's engaging with all these different communities, and that needs to start now. It needs to start yesterday, and it needs to continue on. It needs to continue on over and repeat. As I said at the start, educate. And that education is not just at the school level. It's not just at the with 7-year-olds or 10-year-olds or 15-year-olds. It's for everybody from government, senior ministers, all the way down to local communities, local ministers, local communities, down to the local supply chain, down to the public, down to the schools. It needs to take place at every single level, and it needs to happen continuously. Chris. So technology, there's all sorts of technology that's out there. Everybody's developing all sorts of technology. Is it AC? Is it DC? That depends on distances. Generally, you would have an AC wind farm if it's relatively near shore. Once you get past, it varies depending on technology and seabed conditions and vary. But let's say 50 miles, 80 miles offshore, you then start thinking about going to DC. Because of the losses in the cable. That's without giving a physics lesson here. Then there's the water depths. Once you get a sort of past about 40 meters deep, you're then starting to think about floating technology. You can use monopile. If it's fixed bottom, you can use monopiles or jackets, and then you can do gravity-based foundations. Or if it's a bit deeper, you can then start looking at floating technology and various different types of anchoring arrangements and that floating technology. The issue is at the minute for floating technology, whilst people say there are floating offshore wind farms out there, yes, they are, but generally they're all demonstrator projects at the minute. So what's it demonstrating? It's demonstrating how you can get a turbine to float. Basically, you put a flotation device under the turbine. But what is still being developed is that floating cable technology, particularly the array cable. You're linking turbine to turbine to turbine. You've got to think about the effect the movement's going to have on the cable. And then on top of that, once you start building floating wind farms at scale, you've got to have substations, floating substations out there. You could put them on the seabed, you can put them mid-water, but obviously it's easier to put them on the surface of the water, but that means they're floating. Generally, electrical components, transformers don't like to be shaken around very much. So again, you've got to think about that, that technology, because if you build an HVDC converter station, it's going to be about 20,000 tons. So the flotation devices to keep 20,000 tons on the surface of the water, they're pretty high tech. They're out there because the oil and gas market use them at the moment, but it's offshore wind is still learning how to do that. But thinking about the technology and the turbine sizes and how to go forward, perhaps there's an opportunity again Colombia could think about. I'll sort of come at this from two different angles. One is, think about the consistency, standardization. Perhaps there could be a discussion for the first few wind farms, the first 2, 3, 4 wind farms, as I mentioned before, to help the supply chain. Perhaps there could be smaller wind farms, but go for a standardized approach. Go for the same size turbines. But that means government and developers working together. It may not be what the developers want, because the developers want the maximum yield out of a particular area. But to help the supply chain, if you go for all the same turbines, that means things are going to be easier to learn, quicker to learn, quicker to engage. One way of doing it. So there's pros and cons of doing that, but obviously the government and developers have got to work together and think about that. It hasn't been done elsewhere in the world. That doesn't mean that it shouldn't be done, but the reason why it hasn't been done elsewhere in the world is because it's all been a race. It's been a race. Quick. We want to get things done. We want to be the biggest. We want to be the best. There are pros and cons with that. So there's something to think about there. And one thing that, again, a second thing to think about, a second area to consider, maybe if Colombia is looking at onshore wind, perhaps you could have onshore wind turbines and offshore wind turbines the same size. Then if you do that, an OEM, a wind turbine manufacturer will seriously think about building a factory. What does building a factory do? It creates jobs, and it creates the supply chain for the factory. But again, it's back to that demand. Now, onshore wind turbines are smaller than offshore wind turbines, but then that comes back to my point about if you have smaller turbines, potentially it's easy to do. I'm just throwing ideas out there. This is not necessarily the only approach. Of course, it's not. It's just it's a way potentially of getting onto the ladder very, very quickly. Because the other thing to think about as well, and this is what the UAE have done, is and this kind of proves my point to a certain extent. What the UAE did a few years ago is, rather than that you're getting all these super skyscrapers and everything else over there, and the power demand's been going through the roof in that part of the world, so they're burning their own oil and gas. So what have they done? They built a number of nuclear reactors to power what's going on locally. Now, so that's a good idea, first of all, so tick to that one. But the second thing they did was, rather than building the latest, the newest, the biggest, or the best nuclear reactor, what they built nuclear reactors that the world understood, that had been built before several times, so they were easier to build. The supply chain knew what they were looking at, and what they did is, rather than just building them, they made them gold standards. Everything about those nuclear reactors are gold standard, to the highest the highest systems, the highest procedures, the highest manufacturing levels, and all the rest of it, because it's existing technology. It's existing. People know how to do it. So that's just another example, but I'm just very conscious of time. The last area I'll touch on very, very quickly is ports. So before I hand over to my esteemed colleague Ernesto, who's going to talk a little bit more about ports in a moment, what I would just say is to think about is there are 4 different types of ports in offshore wind. There's the construction port, which is like the site office. It's where all the crews are, and they go backwards and forwards out from there. There's an assembly port, which is where the components come together before they get put onto either a barge or onto the installation vessels and go to the wind farm. There's a fabrication port where things are actually made in the port itself, and then assembled and then sent out to the wind farm. And then there's the operation and maintenance port. Those 4 ports each require different things. You know, the assembly port, for example, where things are assembled, needs a lot of storage area, not much going on. It doesn't need much infrastructure. It's a storage area. Operation O&M ports, they can be smaller because they're just supplying the vessels that are going to go to the wind farm later on. So you know, think about the ports, but also think about the ports don't have to compete with each other. Different ports along the coastline can provide different operations. It doesn't have to be a competition. Again, that working together, that regionalization, that clustering, that supporting what each other's doing is a very, very good approach rather than trying to compete with each other. That's one of the biggest lessons that the UK has learned is, you know, the clustering that now takes place in the UK means that everybody can be involved in the sector and everybody can have a piece of the pie. But I'll leave it there because I know I've probably overrun. So I'll hand over to Ernesto. So thank you very much. Any questions, I'll be happy to answer at the end. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Tony. Creo que has hecho un recorrido de 360 grados de lo que implica construir una industria de eólica marina a partir de la experiencia del Reino Unido. Nos has llevado desde la política, la estabilidad que debe darse, las señales de estabilidad que deben darse a este sector, la importancia de no politizar el sector, porque estamos hablando de temas de seguridad energética. También nos ha hablado de tecnologías, de la importancia de vincular, no hoy, sino desde antier prácticamente, a comunidades, a pescadores, a entrar en un diálogo con ellos prácticamente pues en todos los niveles, educar también a los funcionarios públicos y bueno, hasta estudiantes y personas de la sociedad civil. Ha mencionado un tema muy interesante en el que Ernesto ahora profundizará, que es en relación con los puertos y la importancia de que no compitan entre ellos, sino que pues cada puerto pueda brindar una solución distinta. También mencionó el tema de la importancia de tener fábricas, por ejemplo, construyendo esos componentes para las turbinas eólicas en Colombia y todo lo que eso podría aportar también para la generación de empleo. Ya tenemos varias preguntas en el chat, las seguimos recibiendo para hacérselas al final a Tony, junto a otras, por ejemplo, el tema financiero, creo que también sería interesante que Tony nos comparta a partir de la experiencia del Reino Unido. Adelante, Georgianis.
Gracias, Margarita. Bueno, quiero presentarles el perfil profesional de nuestro expositor Ernesto Forero Fernández de Castro. Ernesto es un abogado especializado en Derecho Comercial y Tributario, consultor legal en temas portuarios, marítimos e infraestructura. Es socio fundador de EF Legal y Asociados, firma dedicada a la asesoría jurídica en asuntos corporativos, portuarios, marítimos y de comercio exterior. Además, también es autor del libro Manual de Derecho Portuario. Ha ejercido también como profesor catedrático en las universidades Sergio Arboleda y Universidad del Norte. Es miembro del Instituto Colombiano de Derecho Marítimo y del Colegio de Abogados Comercialistas de Colombia. Tiene además una amplia trayectoria en publicaciones y estudios sobre derechos corporativos y portuarios. Adelante, Ernesto, bienvenido.
Muchas gracias, Georgianis. Voy a compartir pantalla. Por favor, me confirman cuando la vean. Perfecto. Bueno, muchas gracias. En primer lugar, quiero agradecer a Margarita por tomar esta iniciativa. Todos estos proyectos eólicos y especialmente costa afuera son, como dicen los medios, casi que noticia en desarrollo. En el mismo momento en que estamos conversando, el ANLA publica nuevos términos para el licenciamiento ambiental. Se están terminando los estudios para determinar el nivel de alistamiento de los puertos en Colombia. Está al mismo tiempo en vigencia la primera ronda para los interesados en construir torres eólicas en la costa Caribe, los cuales entregarán sus expresiones de interés el 14 de octubre, por lo cual este es un tema que está totalmente vigente, totalmente en proceso de construcción, lo cual le da una validez aún mayor a este tipo de espacios. Saludo igualmente a Tonny, creo que tomé nota al punto que me tocará resistirme a hacerle más preguntas y un poco ahondar en los puntos que toca. Sin embargo, quiero aprovechar la introducción que hace para hacer la introducción a esta pequeña intervención. En esta oportunidad me enfocaré tal vez en dos puntos que resaltó Tonny en su intervención. Uno serán los puertos y lo segundo será lo que él denomina como stakeholder engagement, que yo lo llamaré para los propósitos de esta intervención el social engagement. Entonces, segundo. Bueno, en primer lugar, quiero hacer un poco de en dónde está Colombia en este momento. En el 2002, con el apoyo del Banco Mundial, Colombia desarrolló la hoja de ruta para la energía eólica costa afuera. El área geográfica que se enfocó para el análisis fue toda la costa Caribe, desde Punta Gallinas hasta el Tapón del Darién. ¿Qué encontró en ese análisis? Encontró un potencial energético de 109 gigavatios, que inclusive redujo a 50 gigavatios si te tiene en cuenta todas las restricciones, tanto técnicas como ambientales, lo cual le da al Caribe colombiano un potencial energético de 50 gigavatios. De esos 50 gigavatios, ¿cuál es el horizonte que se ha fijado el gobierno en su faceta más optimista? Quiere hacer una primera instalación y montaje de torres que le permitan generar primero 9 gigavatios y luego subirlo a 13 gigavatios al 2050. Eso desde el punto de vista de infraestructura es un objetivo ambicioso. Y el gobierno está tomando los pasos correspondientes. Así como Tonny hablaba de los diferentes frentes en donde el primer frente es fijarse las metas, Colombia se ha fijado una meta ambiciosa. En términos de construcción de los permisos y legislación, Colombia está dando pasos orientados hacia ese objetivo. Como nos pudo decir en el punto de puertos, que es donde nosotros nos enfocaremos hoy, básicamente la industria ha hecho una tipología de puertos que pudiéramos resumir en 3 tipos de puertos. Unos puertos de fabricación, unos puertos de montaje y unos puertos que se le conocen como OIM. Dependiendo de la magnitud del proyecto, determinará también la forma como se hará esa construcción de las torres. ¿Qué quisiera como país uno? Y ahí empezamos a conectar con el social engagement. Que el país, así como tiene objetivos ambiciosos, tuviera un objetivo ambicioso en temas de infraestructura. En un reciente estudio realizado por el gobierno de Países Bajos, se determinó un primer análisis del alistamiento de los puertos en Colombia. Producto de ese análisis se identificaron alrededor de 9 puertos con la potencialidad de servir como infraestructura portuaria para los proyectos de energía eólica offshore y estableció, si aquí lo ven, permítanme de puntero, lo ven acá, algunos tipos de infraestructura, de inversiones para poner la infraestructura a punto. Aquí, en esta izquierda, en este lado izquierdo se ven los puertos de fabricación y montaje, y aquí en estas 2 columnas de la derecha, una estimación de inversiones para aquellos puertos que tengan la intención de contar con la infraestructura necesaria para la generación de hidrógeno verde. Como ver, son inversiones relativamente altas. Y digo relativas porque en puertos importantes como los de Cartagena, Barranquilla y Santa Marta, que son los principales puertos de la costa atlántica, ese nivel de inversiones pareciera relativamente bajo. Sin embargo, cuando uno analiza este tipo de inversiones a la luz de la carga que exclusivamente generan los proyectos de energía eólica, puedan que sean unas inversiones sustanciales. Por eso toda la técnica y todos los estudios lo que sugieren y recomiendan es que se trabaje no en puertos que se construyan para ese propósito, sino en puertos que puedan combinar los servicios no solo con la carga asociada a los proyectos eólicos, sino también para otros tipos de carga. De esa manera, la inversión que tendrían que hacer esos puertos, tanto en infraestructura como equipos, no solo se amortizaría con los ingresos derivados de los volúmenes asociados a estos proyectos offshore, sino que también tuvieran en consideración los ingresos asociados a los otros tipos de carga. En un reciente estudio, incluso más reciente que el anterior, y este creo que no tiene 2 semanas de haberse entregado, el Banco Mundial hizo un análisis enfocado en aquellos puertos que pudieran servir para crear el hidrógeno verde. Recuerden que cuando el hidrógeno verde se genera, la forma de transportarlo implica que haya un cambio de su estado gaseoso a un estado líquido. Y ahí es cuando cambia a amoníaco o cambia a etanol. Aquí vemos en este cuadro, en esta tabla, las inversiones en esta columna en términos de CAPEX que tendrían que invertirse en cada uno de estos puertos, tanto para amoníaco como para etanol. Si ven, las inversiones están desde 1.6 billones de dólares a 2.6 billones de dólares. Es decir, a diferencia de lo que fue el slide anterior, y me devuelvo, que son unas inversiones que tendrían que consisten básicamente en adecuaciones de los puertos existentes. Cuando se trata de las inversiones para puertos de hidrógeno verde, cambia sustancialmente el tema. Y el informe incluso va más allá y hace un análisis financiero sobre el escenario base de cómo sería el comportamiento financiero en cada una de esas locaciones si se deciden hacer las inversiones. Y aquí lo que se ven es unos periodos de recuperación que van entre 6 y 13 años, aunque en Cartagena, que es el único que dio un flujo de caja en términos de valor presente neto negativo, los demás, la buena noticia es que son unos valores positivos. Sin embargo, como vimos, son inversiones importantes que se requieren. Entonces, hasta aquí, ¿qué tenemos? Como dijimos, Colombia tiene un ambicioso objetivo en términos de generación de energía eólica offshore, lo cual hace que uno de los componentes fundamentales sean los puertos. Cuando se analizan los puertos, se llega a la conclusión que ninguno de los puertos, en el estado en que actualmente está, es capaz de servir como infraestructura portuaria para atender el volumen de carga asociado a estos proyectos en su escenario optimista. Si nosotros decidimos ir por un escenario menos optimista, pues es muy probable que los puertos actuales, con muy modestas intervenciones, puedan atender esa carga. Pero aquí lo que se está analizando son las inversiones que se harían o que se requerirían en el escenario ambicioso. Es decir, cuando el país decida acometer ese objetivo de los 13 gigavatios. Y una conclusión que ha servido de premisa es que la carga exclusivamente asociada a los proyectos de energía offshore no serían suficientes para amortizar las inversiones que se requieren. Entonces, la pregunta que queda en la mesa es cómo pudiera Colombia lograr este nivel de alistamiento necesario para los puertos, para los proyectos de energía offshore costa afuera, de energía offshore. Entonces, aquí vemos, cuando miramos el el derecho comparado o vemos los modelos internacionales, vemos que los diferentes países han optado por 3 diferentes tipos de modelos. Y estos 3 tipos de modelos no son absolutos, y cuando digo que no son absolutos, me refiero a que no son exactamente, digamos, solamente liderados por el Estado o por el privado, sino que uno ve vasos comunicantes entre uno y otro modelo. Sin embargo, para efectos metodológicos y para efectos del estudio, del entendimiento de cada uno de los modelos, los dividimos en 3. Está el primer modelo, en donde es el Estado, es el público, el que toma el liderazgo. En este tipo de modelos, lo que permite es que el Estado, con una visión más estratégica que en términos de rentabilidad, como sucede con el privado, el Estado, una vez escoge el objetivo que quiere, apropia los recursos para hacerlo. Es decir, el Estado invierte directamente en infraestructura portuaria o incluso en infraestructura que se necesitan los puertos. Por ejemplo, los canales de acceso o las profundizaciones a los puertos. El segundo modelo es el modelo en donde la construcción de infraestructura está liderada por el privado. Aquí tienen unos aspectos importantes, como decía Tonny, hay pros y hay contras. El aspecto importante es que el privado se mueve mucho más rápido que el público, pero el alcance del privado en términos de infraestructura o de inversión es mucho más limitado, porque el privado siempre tendrá la limitación de la recuperación de la inversión. Entonces, si nosotros o un país solamente hace descansar el desarrollo de infraestructura en los hombros de los privados, va a tener un problema, y es que el privado solo hará lo que le permita recuperar su inversión. Lo cual en este tipo de proyectos de esta envergadura puede ser problemático. Y hay un tercer modelo que es un tema de PPPs o de participaciones público-privadas, y especialmente asociado a un modelo que se ha denominado de clusters. Es decir, que no es únicamente la inversión privada, ni es únicamente la inversión pública, sino que se aprovecha todas esas actividades que se requieren para un proyecto, como los proyectos que tendrán que implementarse para lograr los objetivos, con el fin de que generen una dinámica económica. De esa manera, únicamente, por ejemplo, en la zona de los puertos no se enfocarán únicamente en construir patios y muelles, sino que también se enfocarán en construir industrias, fábricas y también nodos de conexión logística entre aquellas industrias que le den respaldo al desarrollo y fabricación de la energía eólica. Considero que este es un modelo, el modelo de PPP y el modelo de clúster es el modelo al que debe optar Colombia. Porque aquí, y como sugería Tonny, es donde se mezclan la necesidad del puerto y la necesidad de la infraestructura con el social engagement. ¿Qué es lo que ha sucedido, y especialmente en zonas como la costa caribe colombiana? Que en la costa caribe, como es en esta la oportunidad, es donde están las oportunidades energéticas. La costa caribe ha sido testigo de las principales extracciones de gas, de carbón, y en esta oportunidad también tiene un gran potencial en energías limpias, como son la energía solar y la energía eólica, tanto onshore como offshore. Sin embargo, lo paradójico, y vean las noticias de ayer, que a pesar de que es en la costa caribe donde está el mayor potencial energético, es en donde la gente sufre de mayor manera, tanto por la falta de energía como por unas tarifas incrementales. Entonces, ¿por qué no podemos olvidar el social engagement? Porque por un lado le estamos diciendo a la población caribe que facilite, que este tipo de proyectos trae beneficios, que facilite el montaje y el desarrollo, pero por otro lado la población no ve ningún tipo de beneficio tangible. Modelos de desarrollo de infraestructura portuaria, como el de PPP o el de clúster, permite armonizar esas dos necesidades. Permite armonizar la necesidad de construcción de infraestructura necesaria para lograr la generación de energía eólica, pero también permite armonizar y atender esas necesidades sentidas de la población. tanto en términos de empleos como de incremento del PIB de la región, como generación de cargos calificados y, ¿por qué no, pensar en que parte de esa energía que se logre se va a revertir en la población en menores tarifas? Es decir, en una especie de seguridad energética regional. Ahora bien, eso es lo que en mi concepto pienso que el país debería lograr, armonizar esos dos intereses. Ahora, ¿por cuál se va Colombia? Es un tema que dependerá del modelo portuario que tenga. Y aquí les pongo algunos tipos de ejemplos de modelo portuario, tanto Dinamarca, Alemania, los Países Bajos, UK, en donde ven que se dividen como en tres tipos de elementos críticos: la propiedad de la tierra y de la infraestructura, el nivel de ayuda del Estado para ese tipo de proyectos de infraestructura, y un poco aquí un tema crítico que lo habló Tonny también, y es el tiempo que se toma para implementar. ¿Qué tenemos en Colombia? En Colombia, sin extenderme, Colombia tiene una particularidad en términos de infraestructura portuaria, y es que toda la infraestructura portuaria se hace con dinero privado. Es decir, ningún puerto en Colombia tiene ninguna participación pública, lo cual ha servido para el desarrollo portuario los últimos 30 años, pero cuando se analiza ese modelo portuario a la luz de proyectos como estos, que probablemente en términos de volumen de carga no permitan que se paguen las inversiones, se vuelve un reto. Y aquí es cuando se vuelve importante, es de qué manera el Estado contribuye, facilita o incluso invierte en este tipo de infraestructuras estratégicas para el país. Un poco de reflexión sobre los modelos. No hay modelos absolutos, y cuando no hay modelos absolutos, cuando afirmo esto, lo que me refiero es que puede ser que un modelo sea liderado por el público, pero esto no necesariamente implique que se haga de espalda a los privados. Y contrario sensu, no quiere decir que si algún puerto o alguna iniciativa inicia en el privado, no quiere decir que los modelos que nos ofrecen otros países se haya hecho sin ningún tipo de participación o incentivos del público. Los modelos, como le dije, dependen de varios factores. Nosotros estamos viendo, o los estudios que hasta ahora se han realizado están viendo la costa Caribe como una especie de gran clúster, ¿sí? Es probable que puertos en Cartagena, en Barranquilla y en Santa Marta y en La Guajira, por supuesto, resulten complementarios. Es decir, que se tenga más de un puerto de fabricación o más de un puerto de montaje y, por supuesto, más de un puerto de operación y mantenimiento. Finalmente, y creo que es la idea que quiero dejar en la mesa, en un país como Colombia, el modelo clúster resulta muy interesante en términos de desarrollo tanto nacional como regional, porque permite armonizar la necesidad de desarrollo de infraestructura para proyectos eólicos offshore, pero también ayuda a atender las necesidades sentidas de una región. ¿Que se puede? Claro que se puede. De hecho, en los análisis se han identificado, y estos son solo algunos prospectos de puertos que pudieran servir como estos modelos tipo clúster. Y les tomé algunos ejemplos en cada uno de los distintos departamentos. Tenemos Puerto Bahía, que es un puerto que está ubicado en la zona portuaria de Cartagena, que aquí le vemos el layout y vemos cómo está en la capacidad de atender las necesidades de los puertos de fabricación y montaje y también los puertos para la generación de hidrógeno verde. En Palermo, que está ubicado en la zona portuaria de Barranquilla, también ofrece, en términos de ubicación y de facilidad portuaria, la capacidad de servir como puesto clúster. Y también en la zona portuaria de Santa Marta está Río Córdoba, que también sirve de manera muy interesante para atender esas necesidades de infraestructura, tanto para los puertos de tipología de fabricación y montaje, como los de operación y mantenimiento, como los puertos para el hidrógeno verde. ¿Cuáles son algunos de los beneficios que este modelo tipo clúster traería? Aquí traigo algunas cifras tomadas de la experiencia danesa. La empresa danesa, en un horizonte de tiempo de 25 años, ha estimado que se generan empleos de 14.500 empleos por gigavatio en 25 años. cosa que pudiéramos trasladar en Colombia, pues, y ya ven cómo va tomando forma esa necesidad de atender el social engagement que hablaba Tonny. También está no solo la cantidad de empleos, sino la calidad de los empleos. Aquí se ven empleos de alto nivel y también con la capacidad de crear astilleros, capacidad de instalar fábricas, capacidad de instalar fábricas de turbinas y de mantenimiento de turbinas, entre otras cosas. Y en términos de inversión, lo que los técnicos llaman unas inversiones del rule of thumb o la regla del pulgar, es que el nivel de inversión que se requieren para la implementación de proyectos eólicos offshore es lo mismo que se requieren para los proyectos eólicos onshore multiplicado por 10. Es decir, que nosotros tenemos una gran oportunidad de que nuestras regiones, y no solo a través del desarrollo de infraestructura portuaria, sino también atrapando otras oportunidades, reciban no solo la inversión que se tiene prevista para la generación de energía eólica onshore, sino la offshore multiplicado por 10. ¿Cómo facilitamos? Y eso fue alguna de las recomendaciones que se hicieron al gobierno. ¿Cómo facilitamos por parte del gobierno esa montaje, construcción y desarrollo de infraestructura portuaria a través de distintos mecanismos que van desde incentivos económicos como creación de regiones y zonas de zona franca, así como dar incluso incentivos tributarios, como también no se descarta la participación de inversión directa del Estado en la construcción de infraestructura. También, obviamente, junto con la banca multilateral, como ha ocurrido en otros países, algún tipo de sistemas de financiamientos que respondan a las realidades de los proyectos. Normalmente los proyectos portuarios en Colombia tienen un horizonte de tiempo de 20 años, pero al nivel de inversiones que se tiene que van cerca de 2 billones, 2.6 billones, como vimos en las estimaciones del Banco Mundial, un horizonte de tiempo de 20 años puede que resulte corto. Entonces, estas son solo algunas ideas de cómo pudiera Colombia propiciar ese alistamiento de la infraestructura portuaria. Y finalmente, aquí que se me acepte una publicidad política no pagada del libro que recientemente publicamos sobre el derecho portuario en Colombia. Muchas gracias a todos.
Muchísimas gracias, Ernesto. Ha sido realmente una presentación muy interesante con la perspectiva de Colombia sobre qué visión tiene el país con estos proyectos que se ha identificado en la hoja de ruta de Eólica Marina y todo tu aporte a partir de tu experiencia en el tema portuario sobre la preparación que requiere el país para que esta industria sea una realidad y, por supuesto, maximizar las oportunidades que este sector podría traer al país. Y has tocado también unos temas muy sensibles como el relacionamiento con las comunidades y, por supuesto, aportar a la seguridad y calidad energética y también accesibilidad en cuanto a los precios en el Caribe colombiano, que creo que también tiene que ver mucho con el concepto de justicia energética del que se viene hablando en todo el mundo y en Colombia también. Tenemos varias preguntas. Vamos a iniciar entonces con las preguntas a los panelistas que vamos a recibir acá en el chat y también nos gustaría escuchar a viva voz a uno o dos de ustedes. Entonces, vamos a empezar con las preguntas en el chat y luego si hay algún voluntario que quiera hacer la pregunta en vivo, también nos sirve mucho porque es muy interesante escucharlos y verlos porque bueno, fomenta más una conversación. Y voy a hacer un poco, pues acá las preguntas en inglés a Tonny para que me pueda escuchar. Tonny, many thanks for your presentation. Here we have several questions from the audience in the Q&A. Several questions are related to environmental aspects, others regarding the technology, and another one regarding stakeholder engagement. And I do have another one regarding the financial aspects of offshore wind. And we can start with this question from Adriana on stakeholder engagement. What did the UK do to promote this stakeholder engagement? This is the question from Adriana. What type of strategies were used to communicate with communities, and which was the best?
It was, as I said, it was that everybody did it. Everybody. The important thing is the message is the same from whoever. Whatever, you know, so it doesn't matter whether it's government, local government, regional government, developers, the message needs to be the same. So that's the first thing in terms of consistency of what people are saying. That's at a very, very high level. The other thing is working out what, you know, particular stakeholders have particular issues. So the important message there is to answer the concerns, because the reason why most people are raising concerns are about something that's going to affect them either personally, professionally, from a business point of view. So what the messaging needs to do to those, you know, those different people is answer their particular concerns. Don't just send out blanket responses to, you know, to lots and lots of different questions. It has to be on a bespoke, individual basis. You know, so it could be the fishing community are going to need a separate messaging to what the leisure industry needs, for example, or from what the oil and gas industry needs. It's got to be very, very focused responses. The high level message can be the same, but once you get down into the next level, it has to be bespoke in terms of what, you know, depending on who you're talking to. It has to be consistent. So what you don't want is when talking to, for example, the fishing community, you don't want developer A saying something different to developer B, which is something different to what the government is saying. That has to be consistent, because as soon as you start having the information is different, that's when people can start picking holes in it. So it has to be very consistent from that point of view. It has to be very focused, and it has to be very consistent. But it has to be repeated. 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 It's like if you think about when you watch an advert on television for the first time, you only remember it after you've seen it the seventh time or whatever it is. So it's the same with this as well. You only start to remember these things when you've been told the same consistent message. And also, what's very, very important, as I said, is, you know, think about the sort of countermeasures to the misinformation that's going out there. Don't just react to the misinformation. Be proactive. Get the messaging out, and that's what we've been doing in the UK. It's been very proactive in terms of what offshore wind can do, the jobs that can be created, the inward investment that can take place, the creation, the training, the retraining of skill sets, the use of existing sites, brownfield sites. There's so much different messaging that's taking place out there. And what we're seeing in the UK now is everybody wants to be the best in the UK. The best place to go for offshore wind in the UK is this area or this area, this area. So everybody is giving that messaging about how positive offshore wind can be, both financially for the local community, the local supply chain, the job market, and all the rest of it. But also, let's not forget, the global aspect, global warming. That's the reduced reliance on fossil fuels, the reduced reliance on deforestation, for example, as well. It's a key issue in South America. So there are various, it's back to messaging, consistency, but focused at the same time, depending on who you're talking to. At the UK, for example, 20 years ago, everybody in the UK hated offshore wind. Now everybody loves offshore wind in the UK because people have seen the benefits of it. People have seen how things have developed. What the offshore wind community was saying 20 years ago is coming true now, because it wasn't, we weren't making it up. We were saying how we saw these things working out and growing. and that is you know, it's key, you know, to the future of offshore wind.
But I do have a follow-up question, because I'd like to zoom in a bit more on what's the role of the government in stakeholder engagement. Because in Colombia, one of the particularities of the country is that this stakeholder engagement is left to the companies, to the developers by themselves. And the government doesn't engage with communities to explain to them what are the plans of the government with this. For instance, in the Netherlands, we know about the offshore wind energy dialogues that involved not only offshore wind, it was like presenting the offshore wind industry to the other wind industries and the local communities. You have the militaries, the telecoms. Then what has been the role of the UK government promoting this stakeholder engagement?
Yeah, well, it's the messaging. So that stakeholder engagement. To pick up your point there from the government, yes. So what the UK government has done stakeholder engagement because it has funded, you know, stakeholder engagement. It has funded. It has provided funds so people can go out, you know, and talk to local communities about the projects. But the other thing that the government needs to do, again, I mentioned this before, is be consistent. And what you don't want to see is, while a developer is talking to the local community about how good offshore wind is going to be and, you know, how it's going to create jobs, what you don't want to see is the government saying, well, we're not sure offshore wind's the right thing for this government. We're not sure this offshore wind is the right thing for the community. We're not sure, you know, we don't believe in global warming. We don't believe. That's, you know, what you want is, you want a consistent message. It doesn't have to be in any detail, but you need a consistent message from the government saying that they support offshore wind. That's almost all the government needs to do, because and then provide that. I see there's a question that's just come up. What support does the government provide? Well, what specifically, the financial support that the government have been providing is there is financial support, because there are concessions that are given to offshore wind developers, and there are also the government is providing set limits between which if the energy that's been produced is between two limits, that's fine. If the energy becomes too expensive to produce for whatever reason, the government caps it so the ratepayer doesn't have to pay any more. But if the energy that produced is lower than the band, the government get the revenue, get some of the revenue back from the wind farm developer. So the government is providing financial incentives to and it's fixing the limits that the ratepayer has to pay, but it's also giving that consistent message as well. So whilst a particular developer that's building a wind farm off the coast of a particular area, that developer will be responsible for that local engagement, but what they are seeing is a consistent message coming from the British government about how they're supporting offshore wind, and that's how you get things moving. So it works on a number of different levels. One, consistent message. Yes, there has been funding for stakeholder engagement, but there's also funding provided in terms of the limits that people will pay.
Thanks, Tony. Tenemos en el chat también unas preguntas para Ernesto. Pues son principalmente comentarios lo que tenemos. Y bueno, aquí pues nos comentan que para proyectos de tamaño medio se requieren más de 30 hectáreas y ningún proyecto, ningún puerto tiene esa cantidad de espacio en este momento. También nos preguntan que por qué no se considera la costa pacífica como ubicación ideal de los proyectos eólicos marinos. También nos mencionan que Puerto Bolívar y Puerto Brisa tienen unas características de espacio e infraestructura y otras desventajas, que tal vez Brisa, pero Puerto Bolívar no, porque está al servicio de Cerrejón. Son como unas preguntas y comentarios todo mezclado, pero apunta un poco a lo mismo.
Bueno, ¿por qué no la costa pacífica? Bueno, eso sí no lo sé.
Pero yo sí lo sé, yo sí lo
Bueno,
sé. La
bueno,
respuesta está en la hoja de ruta de energía eólica marina en Colombia y además, aún más preciso, el Atlas Mundial del Viento. Cuando uno observa el Atlas Mundial del Viento, pues ahí podemos ver que el mayor potencial está en el Caribe colombiano. En el Pacífico no hay potencial para proyectos eólicos marinos.
bueno, bien. Mencionaron Puerto Bolívar, Puerto Brisa y que se necesitan alrededor de 60 hectáreas. Vea, hay, como explicó Tony, hay diferentes formas de volver estos proyectos una realidad. Incluso los estudios lo que sugieren es que si hay alguna restricción en términos de infraestructura, una opción es ensamblar las torres en otro lado, traérselas flotando, hacer digamos, traer unos componentes menores a los puertos actuales y simplemente a través de barcazas, como lo explicó Tony, pudieran implementarse ese tipo de proyectos. Eso, si bien es viable técnicamente, digamos que no parece condescendiente con los objetivos ambiciosos del Estado y se estaría perdiendo la oportunidad de combinar esa necesidad con el desarrollo regional que yo sugiero. Entonces, yo pienso que Colombia sí debe buscar, sí debe tener un objetivo ambicioso en términos de infraestructura portuaria. Entonces, la necesidad del área puede ser relativa, puede llegar hasta 60, probablemente sí, sí hay puertos que lo tengan, de los que les expliqué, Río Córdoba la tiene, Palermo tiene una zona desarrollable muy interesante y creo que incluso Puerto Bolívar se analizó. El problema que yo le veo a Puerto Bolívar tal vez es que con las devoluciones de las minas de carbón se pierde un poco el volumen que ese carbón provee en términos de la posibilidad de utilizar otro tipo de cargas para amortizar inversiones. Entonces, dejarles las únicas, digamos, la única volumen que es el derivado del proyecto eólico como carga que genere ingresos para amortizar las inversiones, lo veo difícil. Pero en la costa caribe sí hay sitios, como les expliqué, que tienen las características tanto físicas como geográficas para servir para puertos tipo clúster para este tipo de proyectos.
Gracias, Ernesto. Tenemos otras preguntas para Tony y no sé si alguien en el público quiera hacerle una pregunta en directo para poder verlo y escucharlo. Si tienen interés, aquí me mandan el mensaje y le damos el micrófono y que podamos verlo. There are other questions, Tony, that I've seen that you have already answered on the chat, but maybe you can talk to us so everybody can hear. And some are about the technology, like what's the recommendation? I think this is a question from Jairo, and he asks if there is a recommendation on the size of the wind farms if we want to build one of more than 1 giga, for example.
Yeah, I mean, it comes back to, I guess, the first point is, you know, is Colombia going to go down the route of building the same size onshore as offshore wind turbines? So the answer is no. My suggestion there is, you know, the latest technology, the latest wind farms that have been built in Europe are kind of 12 to 15 megawatt, are using 12 to 15 megawatt turbines. The next stage is to build 20 megawatt turbines. By the time Colombia is ready to build, so let's say 5 years' time, that 50 megawatt technology will be known and will be understood. So my suggestion would be, let's go down the 15 megawatt route. You know, California, for example, is saying, well, all their wind farms are based on 20 megawatts, but that 20 megawatt floating technology doesn't exist yet. So why not use technology that actually exists and build those first couple of wind farms using 15 gigawatts? I mean, there's wind farms in the North Sea that are using, 0.5 megawatt, 1.2, 3.6, 7. So going to 15, they are big turbines, but it's technology that people know and understand because they are being built now. So my suggestion perhaps would be, and others will contradict me, I know they will, but my suggestion would be, use technology that exists and let's go down the 15 megawatts size.
Thanks, Tony. I think you were also clear on advising like to start small with the projects with a smaller size, then the country starts creating the capacities for this industry.
Yeah, yep. Sorry.
And for Ernesto, we have an interesting question also on the chat, and it is, tenemos una pregunta y es en relación con si lo que se necesita es construir nuevos puertos o adaptar los puertos existentes, lo cual puede ser más económico y más eficiente. Esta pregunta es de David Reins, que no sé si le gustaría también hacer la pregunta directamente. Bueno, hace esa pregunta.
Sí, es muy buena pregunta y es muy buena anotación. Y de hecho, en el análisis que se hizo particularmente por el gobierno danés, lo que sugiere son mejoras a la infraestructura existente. ¿Por qué? Porque el objetivo ambicioso de Colombia no se logra con un solo proyecto, sino que eso se va logrando con pequeños proyectos que van haciéndose año a año, ¿ok? Que deben surtir desde ya diferentes etapas, desde el licenciamiento hasta el alistamiento, construcción. Entonces, esperar a que exista un superpuerto, un megapuerto, que esté listo para que a partir de eso empiecen a hacerse los proyectos, no es realista. Entonces, el análisis siempre fue qué puertos y en qué estado de alistamiento están los puertos del Caribe colombiano. De ese análisis y ese primer assessment que se hizo, se identificaron alrededor de 9 puertos ubicados en La Guajira, en el Magdalena, en Atlántico y en Bolívar, que pudieran servir para este tipo de proyectos. Servir como, dependiendo de las 3 tipologías de puertos que les dije, le encontraron alguna, digamos, funcionalidad a cada uno de estos. Hay algunos que pueden servir como puertos de fabricación, hay otros que pueden servir como puertos para el montaje y hay otros puertos que pueden servir para operación y mantenimiento. Entonces, el enfoque definitivamente es cómo podemos utilizar los puertos actuales y hacer los incrementos en términos de infraestructura en que se requiere. Eso que suena lógico desde el punto de vista contractual es todo un reto, porque en Colombia los puertos o las personas ocupan área pública para construir un puerto por virtud de unos contratos. Y esos puertos que están en la actualidad instalados son contratos que ya tienen un término vigente, que es probable que si hacen las inversiones para atender el volumen offshore, no van a tener el tiempo suficiente para amortizar las inversiones. Entonces, incluso en las recomendaciones que se les está haciendo al Estado para poder incentivar el acometer las inversiones ya, es decir, hombre, de las condiciones para que puedan garantizarse unas prórrogas de los contratos con el fin del que el privado pueda desde ya hacer las mejorías que necesita su infraestructura.
Sí, esas recomendaciones están muy interesantes y no sé, también mencionan en los comentarios como referencia el puerto de Rotterdam. No sé si también lo tuviste en cuenta en el reporte.
Sí, digamos que el puerto de Rotterdam, entiendo el comentario que lo que quieren decir es un poco como el modelo de puerto, que el puerto de Rotterdam no es solo un terminal, sino es una gran zona portuaria que incluye varios terminales, lo cual de alguna manera transmite la idea de clúster. Eso aquí, digamos, pudiera hacerse tal vez en puertos como el de Barranquilla, que tiene, digamos, una gran zona portuaria de 22 kilómetros. Sin embargo, Barranquilla tiene unos problemas con el tema de calado. Recuerden que el puerto de Barranquilla es un puerto fluvial que para determinadas funciones que necesitan los proyectos eólicos requieren buques de gran calado. Entonces yo creo que el mensaje de entender la necesidad portuaria como un clúster parecido al de Rotterdam aplica, pero no solo como en la zona portuaria de Rotterdam, sino viendo como clúster toda la zona Caribe.
Gracias, muy interesante ese punto de vista. Y I do have a final question for Tony. About a point that was also raised here regarding the financial support of the UK government for offshore wind projects. And to give you a bit more of context, in Colombia, recently the government adopted a contract for difference model to support offshore wind projects. We also know that in the UK, this scheme has been used for many years, and recently it was modified to strengthening it. It was extended, I think, from 15 to 20 years. Then, and I want to connect it also with another comment from Ernesto, because he mentioned like the expectations that to decrease the electricity price to the consumers, particularly in the Caribbean coast. And what has been the experience of the UK implementing this CFD mechanism, and how has it impacted the electricity price? And of course, we know that these offshore wind projects are more expensive, as Ernesto also mentioned, but there are also these expectations of decreasing the electricity price. Then it is good also to address these expectations. And of course, we know that the higher price is for the electricity that you can get. Then in Colombia, we already have several issues with electricity security. Then would like to know your insights on this.
Sure. I guess the first thing I would say is, when and I might contradict Ernesto here a little bit, and I apologize, Ernesto, for this. When people are looking at the cost of electricity from a wind farm, you're looking at the cost of electricity that it's going to be when the wind farm is built, and that could be 5 years' time. So what you're doing is you're predicting a price now, or you're not predicting, you're telling people what the price of the electricity is going to be in 5 years' time. And what people do, or 10 years' time, depending on when the wind farm is built, what people are doing is they're comparing that to what the electrical prices, the electricity prices are today. Now, the problem that is, you're comparing with electricity prices with the existing electrical generators. There might be oil and gas, there might be nuclear, there might be whatever, onshore wind, whatever it is. So they're not really comparing like with like, because who can say what the price of oil and gas will be in 5 years' time? What the offshore wind industry has been asked to do is to put a price on it in 5 years' time and hold to that price that it's going to be in 5 years' time for the next X years thereafter. So so if the price in 5 years' time is 5, and the price builds up over the next 20 years to say 10, if the price in oil and gas now is 2, yeah, of course it's more expensive. But what's oil and gas going to be in 5 years' time? What's oil and gas going to be in 20 years' time? No one knows that. No one predicts that. So what offshore wind is doing is it's telling people now how much electricity is going to be in a few years' time. Now, what we're starting, and that's with with new existing, so again, back to some of the countries that are developing offshore wind, people are kind of not really understanding that, because you're not comparing apples with apples. What we're seeing in the UK now, because the supply chain is in place, it's a global supply chain, because we know how to build wind farms, we know how to do this, we know how to do that, we know what the connection costs are going to be, we know what the transmission costs are going to be. What we're seeing now is that some of the cheapest LCOE, which is low levelized cost of energy, now for an offshore wind farm, it's actually the cheapest form of electricity that's going to be in the UK, because the wind farms are such a size, and there's so many of them together, that actually, when you're talking multi gigawatts of power coming ashore, that power, because they're all being built in the same sort of places. I'm thinking, particularly sort of Dogger Bank, which is as far as the UK side, is a 4.8 gigawatt wind farm. Those costs are predicted to be actually some of the cheapest forms of electricity now. So yes, I agree. If you simply look at a single wind farm being built in 5 years' time, comparing those costs to what they are now, yes, it is more expensive. So we in general, what we're seeing in the UK is the reason why some electricity bills have gone up. It's as much about building the infrastructure, the transmission system, as it is about building the generator itself. So you've got to remember that when people think about building a wind farm, you're not just building a wind farm, you're building that infrastructure that's got to support that onshore. You're building that transmission system, you're upgrading the transmission system, which probably needs to be upgraded anyway. It certainly did in the UK, and I'm sure it does in most countries as we move. Generally, in most countries in the world now, we're moving away from centralized generation, so big generating plants, big nuclear power plants, or big coal-fired plants, or whatever they are. We're moving away to decentralized generation, which means the transmission infrastructure has to change, both on the transmission side and less so on the distribution side, but certainly on the transmission side it has to change. That all has to be taken into account when you're building a wind farm. So it really depends on the pricing mechanism. And in the UK, the government have seen this and have looked at the long-term picture and the long-term implications of offshore wind. That's why people like it in the UK, because what we're starting to see now is those costs are actually starting to tumble down.
Many thanks, Tony. Me gustaría, si quieren, dar como unos mensajes finales ya para concluir el webinar. See if Tony wants to send a final message. Here we have read comments from the audience like Juan Laverde, who says that this type of conversations and insights should be heard by the Colombian government as well, and because they have liked a lot all the perspectives and ideas that have been shared here. Entonces, no sé, Ernesto, si quisieras dar un mensaje final, if Tony would like to send a final message.
After you, Tony.
Thank you. No, I think it is. There is a to sum up. I think there's a offshore wind brings many benefits. It's not. People say they don't want power generations in their backyard. Well, it's out to sea, and in general, unless you can see around the curvature of the earth, you can't see most wind farms from shore. So generally, you can't see it from that point of view. It does help with global warming. It does help. It's an endless power source. You don't have to pay for the fuel on an ongoing basis. It's effectively free. It does create jobs. It does create innovation. It does create regeneration. It does create retraining. It is part of the energy mix. It's not the answer. It is part of the mix. That's what people have got to remember. It is one component of a number of different ways of powering the transmission system, depending on what the sun is doing, depending on what the wind is doing, depending on how much coal prices are, depending on how much oil and gas prices are. It is part of the mix. It is not the answer. But it can provide an awful lot of power. I mean, I'll just do this quickly. There's in the UK, the UK's national grid is run by National Grid, and at the minute in the UK, as a country, total 52% of our electricity being generated at this very second, 52% is coming from wind. 17 is coming from gas, and 10 is coming from coal. 7 is from nuclear. That changes on an hourly basis. But what that means is, as of this very second, the UK is 70% zero carbon. Now, isn't that a goal that we all want to go to in terms of the future of the planet, as well as creating jobs, as well as creating the training and retraining and creating money and generating money. We're thinking about the bigger picture as well, and that's where everybody can go. And if everybody thought about that in the same way, but perhaps we wouldn't have global warming. Perhaps we wouldn't have the ice caps melting. Perhaps we wouldn't have. And I'll say this as the last. The fish heading north towards the North Pole, that are therefore being followed by the whales. I won't say anything more about whales. Ernesto, over to you.
Thank you, Tony. No, yo quiero reforzar igualmente la idea de Tony. Yo creo que este tipo de proyectos para un país y para una región como Colombia no tenemos ninguna razón por la cual no hacerlo y no tenemos ninguna razón por la cual no apuntar a un objetivo ambicioso. No solo porque estamos contribuyendo para la matriz energética, sino por todo lo que tiene detrás. Colombia ha sido y ha sido criticado por ser un poco dependiente del petróleo y aquí tenemos una gran oportunidad no solo de contribuir con uno de los objetivos ambientales, sino para revertir estos objetivos en nuevas oportunidades, en generación de tecnología, en importación de tecnología, en desarrollo regional, desarrollo del talento humano. Creo que es una gran oportunidad histórica que tiene el país, de manera que yo simplemente quiero resaltar esa oportunidad y que todos estemos como en sintonía para no dejar aparte las discusiones duras que deban hacerse, pero no por eso dejar de perseguir los proyectos.
Muchísimas gracias, Ernesto, Tony, Georgianis. Ha sido realmente un webinar muy iluminador, como dirían en inglés, donde hemos aprendido mucho. También tener esa visión, por supuesto, del Reino Unido, segundo mercado en eólica marina en el mundo, después de China, y todos esos aportes tan interesantes que nos hace Tony en relación con el precio de la electricidad, cómo se ha reducido y toda la cadena de valor que se ha generado alrededor de esta industria. Para terminar nuestro webinar, como les anuncié al principio, quería compartirles queremos compartirles desde la red eólica marina la primera conferencia de energía eólica marina que realizaremos en Colombia. No sé si pueden ver ya mi pantalla, ¿pueden verlo? Bueno, quería compartirles acá en primicia, ya pronto vamos a sacar la información al público sobre esta conferencia que estamos organizando en alianza con la Universidad del Norte, una universidad de gran prestigio en la costa caribe colombiana. Serán 2 días dedicados exclusivamente a analizar en un ángulo de 360 grados, lo que significa la industria de eólica marina en Colombia, y vamos a llevar, por supuesto, esta conversación al lugar donde debe estar, que es en Barranquilla, en la costa caribe, donde se espera que se construyan los primeros proyectos. Vamos a tener paneles donde vemos no solo la parte tecnológica, portuaria, la primera ronda de energía eólica marina. Estamos haciendo además un esfuerzo enorme por traer a panelistas internacionales para que puedan hablarnos también de qué está pasando con la eólica marina en el mundo y también traer una perspectiva latinoamericana de qué están haciendo países como Brasil, Uruguay y Chile para avanzar en la energía eólica marina. También tendremos un panel acá con nuestros amigos del Instituto de Ambiente de Estocolmo sobre comunidades y vamos a traer también a comunidades pesqueras que tanto fueron mencionadas también por Tony, para que nos hablen, nos den su perspectiva sobre esta industria, cuál es su posición y también sus necesidades para que esto tenga un desarrollo armónico. Ernesto también nos acompañará en el panel de puertos y logística, así que desde ya están invitados a participar, a que nos apoyen en esta ambición que tenemos de tener esta conferencia este año. Y bueno, súper atentos a nuestras redes donde les compartiremos mucha más información sobre este evento que será sin duda un hito para avanzar en el conocimiento de esta industria en Colombia. Como lo dijo Tony, lo resaltó tantas veces, aquí se requiere educar, educar y educar. No es suficiente todo lo que hablemos sobre esta industria para lo que requerimos en el país en este momento de entender esta nueva industria, y que estoy muy segura que también será muy interesante para otros países en América Latina y en el mundo que están interesados en desarrollar la industria. Y bueno, saludos también a nuestra audiencia en América Latina. Tenemos a personas de Brasil, de Uruguay, de otras partes del mundo que se han conectado, y por supuesto de Colombia. Muchísimas gracias a todos. Gracias Ernesto, Tony, Georgianis y a todos los que nos han acompañado en esta sesión de hoy, que esperamos publicar online también para que tenga incluso un mayor impacto. Muchas gracias a todos. Nos vemos en noviembre, que será nuestra próxima gran actividad. Gracias, Jairo. Y bueno, también han pedido compartir sus contactos por si luego quieren contactar a Ernesto, por si quieren contactar a Tonny Kinewell. Entonces, esperamos también compartirles esos contactos. Gracias Raúl. Jennifer, Elsa, muchas gracias Jairo, Daniel, gracias a todos. Un gran abrazo desde Colombia. Saludos a España, Daniel. Hasta luego. Gracias Delma. Tony, thank you so much. Gracias Jennifer por la traducción, también por todo el apoyo con la traducción. Muchas gracias a Chris que nos acompaña también de Kinewell. Gracias a todos. Muchas gracias, Chris. Thank you so much, Chris.
De nada, muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Margarita.
Muchas gracias. Gracias.
Chaito, gracias.
Vamos a seguir en contacto. Mil gracias. Chao.
Chao.